Bangladesh is a country within South Asia. It gained independence from Pakistan in 1971, following a civil war assisted by India, who had recently gained her own independence in the partition of British India in 1947. This same partitioning resulted in East and West Pakistan, the latter later becoming Bangladesh, and was the cause of the 2 decades of political oppression and systemic racism from the West Pakistan-based government. Bangladesh is the 8th largest country by population, and one of the most densely populated. Bangladesh only borders 2 countries, with India surrounding it from the north, west and east, and Myanmar to the southeast. Bangladesh's population is constantly growing, due to both its fertility rate, which, though falling, is still above replacement, and the added influx of Rohingya refugees, fleeing the genocide in Myanmar, placing it firmly in the 3rd stage of the demographic transition model. As of 2025, Bangladesh's extreme poverty rate was estimated to be 9.35%, an increase from 2022's rate of 5.6%. This rise is largely attributed to economic slowdown, rising inflation, and climate-related disasters. Over 1.6 million Bengalis are living in extreme poverty, and a further 1.2 million are estimated to be enslaved peoples, one of the worst countries for modern-day slavery in the world. Climate refugees attempting to migrate to India and those experiencing extreme poverty are at a higher risk of human trafficking and slavery. These people are especially at risk, as they lack the resources to weather the storms that flood their low-lying homes. Neither do the many Rohingya refugees stuck in overcrowded, vulnerable camps along the border with Myanmar on Bangladesh's southeast coast, totaling somewhere over 1 million. Their plight, as well as the rest of Bangladesh, is only worsened by the country's geography. Almost all of Bangladesh is barely above sea level, and the wet tropical climate, prone to flooding, tropical cyclones, and high tides, does not bode well for the nation's continued survival in the face of more frequent and more intense weather events. Climate change driven by the enhanced greenhouse effect warms the oceans and makes the atmosphere moister, leading to cyclones with heavier rainfall, stronger winds, and worse storm surges. Bangladesh is one of the most rapidly developing countries in the world, with an incredibly fast-growing economy, though her economic growth has been slowed somewhat by corruption, the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation, political instability, and a lack of sufficient power supplies. Textiles amount for over 84% of her exports, making her an important piece in the fast fashion industry and causing rampant local pollution. Bangladesh is also home to the largest mangrove forest in the world, the Sundarbans. This forest, spanning 10,000 square kilometers, is both a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well as home to multiple wildlife and dolphin sanctuaries. These coastal forests, located in the Ganges River Delta, the largest river delta in the world, are extremely vulnerable to a changing climate. Climate change doesn't just threaten the delicate ecology of the mangroves, which support the habitats of more than 1,000 different species, including endangered Bengal tiger. The mangrove forests and the larger delta that they grow on are also home to around 170 million Bengali people, despite the growing risk of floods from monsoons, tropical cyclones, and heavy Himalayan runoff. And climate change is most certainly to blame for the rampant degradation of the mangrove ecosystem. Flooding, caused by heavy rains and seasonal monsoons, plays an important role in the agricultural industry of the area, depositing fertilizing sediment onto the land. But as the climate shifts towards more frequent and more destructive extreme weather, the damages of these floods outweigh the benefits. When the flood cycle becomes more extreme and irregular, the previously reliable monsoon season is replaced by heavy flooding and violent drought. In 2017, flooding lasted for 5 whole months, destroying crops and houses in one of the worst flooding events in the country's history. Each year, more of Bangladesh's land is eroded away and more citizens face food insecurity. Many climate refugees from regional areas are being forced to move into urban areas, mostly the capital, Dhaka, an already severely overcrowded megacity with a population of over 24 million. Houses and schools are being built on raised platforms to avoid floodwater, but nothing can be done for the extensive freshwater contamination and resulting increase in salinity and waterborne disease, which will only be worsened by food insecurity and displacement. And nothing is being done to prevent these floods in the first place, or to prevent them from getting worse, which they will every single year. No number of shelters or aid packages will save Bangladesh when, by 2050, over a third of the nation's arable land is gone. The developed world needs to take accountability for Bangladesh, and not just for climate change. During Bangladesh's colonial period, wealthy landowners ordered the construction of permanent levees to hold back monsoons, rather than the temporary levees that had been used for centuries beforehand. These permanent levees increased temporary agricultural production, but in the long term it seriously affected land fertilization by preventing sedimentation. Then, during the British Raj, Britain destroyed forests and wetlands by forcing the construction of railroads, which also helped to spread malaria. This, as well as the political issues and social issues caused by centuries of European colonial rule, has led Bangladesh to where she is today. Clearly, reparations are needed in the form of actual, well-thought-out plans to both build up Bangladesh's flood-resistant infrastructure and mitigate the effects of climate change on the country. And these plans must be drawn up in accordance with the natural cycles of the rivers, the Delta, and the Bay of Bengal. In the 60s, a plan to construct large-scale levees was put in place by USAID, a Western aid organisation, that entirely neglected the role of rivers in the ecology of Bangladesh. These levees did as they always had, preventing sedimentation and promoting salinisation. this project did nothing to minimise the flooding damage in Bangladesh's coastal areas. The plan was such a failure that, starting in the 90s, Bangladeshi villages erased its works and replaced them with tidal river management, a method that enhances sedimentation, creating new land that is less prone to waterlogging and better for agriculture. Bangladesh previously led the Climate Vulnerable Forum as chair in 2011 to 2013 and 2020 to 2022. The CVF is a global forum of countries who are disproportionately affected by climate change. It's aimed to address the negative impacts of climate change on socio-economically and environmentally vulnerable nations. It also aims to hold more developed countries accountable for climate change and its consequences globally. Bangladesh produces barely 0.3% of world greenhouse gas emissions, despite its large population, and yet is one of the most exposed to climate change and rising sea levels. Just half a metre of sea level increase could result in the displacement of 18 million Bangladeshi citizens. We need to do better, and we, as developed nations that are the most to blame for climate change and often the least affected by its consequences, must work in the interest of the planet and the people living on it who are innocent in its destruction. It is a simple fact that the populations who are most at risk are the poorest, the least developed, and the least guilty. This is in part due to more developed nations simply being more consumeristic and producing more waste and emissions than less developed countries. But it is also due to the historical and current exploitation of developing countries. But it isn't colonial times anymore. It is no longer acceptable for wealthy countries to exploit the poverty of developing nations in the global south, and we cannot sit by and allow it to continue. Bangladesh has already had its resources and land pillaged, but many countries are actively being mistreated, and whatever solutions are brought in to solve the climate-based issues affecting Bangladesh must take that into account as well. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, when global warming was at a 1-degree increase since pre-industrial times. 10 years later, and the planet has warmed by approximately 0.55 degrees more, and that rate is only accelerating. Fossil fuel expansion, pollution, and unsustainable practices by developing countries like Bangladesh is terrible, but it's not their fault. They don't have a choice. We do. Clearly, our governments and global organisations are failing us, driving climate change and poverty to line their own pockets while the majority suffer. None of us are exempt from the responsibility to do better. We need to hold our governments and ourselves accountable because none of us live in a vacuum. Natural disasters, famines, extreme poverty, environmental destruction, the extinction of thousands of species. Just because it isn't happening to you or in your country doesn't mean that it won't affect you, or that we don't need to help and work to prevent further loss. We owe it to our planet, and we owe it to each other as human beings. We live in a globalized world where everyone and everything is connected. So act like it and have compassion and fight for the people who are facing our consequences.